Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest School of Theology's Lunch and Learn sessions. Uh, we're almost at the end of the academic year, and by the end of this presentation, I'll tell you what to look forward to for the next one. Today, we're very pleased to welcome the Reverend Dr. Britta Myers Carlson, who is visiting assistant professor of practical theology here at the School of Theology. Britta teaches courses in parish leadership, theology, pastoral Spanish, and previously she served on the staff of the United Lutheran Seminary in Pennsylvania and as an ELCA mission developer amongst immigrants living in Boston, Massachusetts. She's a graduate of Boston University, Luther Seminary, and Concordia College. And with all that communal learning and action, she's going to be talking to us today about Christian identity after Nicaea. Britta, how is the technology behaving? Are you ready to go?
Well, as these things go, technology isn't behaving as we intended it, but I think we can go ahead and get started with the
Okay. But I
presentation.
just say that if you've got questions or comments, observation, no, we're not dealing with observation. If you've got questions, questions only, then please put them into the Q&A box at the bottom, and I will represent them to Britta at the end of her presentation. So, Britta, take it away, please.
All right, thank you, Justin, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I'm really it's a privilege that you are spending your lunch hour learning about a topic that I think is really important. And so I'm going to see if we can get our PowerPoint presentation started here for all of you. And I am going to trust that my colleagues will let me know if there are any technical difficulties. Um, so I'm talking about Nicaea today and the legacy of Nicaea for us in the church into the present. How does this thing that happened 1701 years ago continue to impact the way that we live in a life of faith together? I have a brief overview for those of you who would find that helpful. I'm going to start with a little bit of historical overview. I will leave the nitty-gritty details of the council to my friends who are church historians, but I do want to give just some context, perhaps some review for those of you who learned about Nicaea some decades ago. What happened at the council? And what are some of the key takeaways that we can be thinking about as we continue on into the present? I want to talk just very briefly about church and politics. I think that that's one of the most important themes coming out of Nicaea. And then from there, we will move on, and I'm going to talk about some frameworks for Christian unity that I think can be helpful for us as we can continue to consider the implications of the First Council of Nicaea. So a lot of these reflections are coming out of an experience that I had last fall. I was fortunate to participate in a conference celebrating, commemorating, considering the implications and the lasting impact of the First Council of Nicaea. Some of you may have followed the many events and commemorations and celebrations that happened last year, 2025, as the church was commemorating 1700 years since this important event. There was the very famous peace statement that came from Pope Leo and Patriarch Bartholomew. There were World Council of Churches events. So all sorts of opportunities to consider how Nicaea continues to affect us today. The conference that I attended in Thessaloniki was really focused on the way that we as an ecumenical church, as an international church, continue to grapple with our unity. That was really kind of a sub-theme of the conference. And so that's kind of going to be the tenor of what I talk about with you all today. The hospitality that we received in Thessalonica, I would be remiss not to mention it. We were invited to Nicaea at the invitation of the Metropolitan of Thessaloniki. Thessaloniki, as some of you may know, is the city where Aristotle wrote many of his most important philosophical contributions. It's a city that Paul once walked in, and it continues to be a sort of center for Orthodox intellectual contemplation as well as Orthodox intellectual engagement with ecumenical thinking. It was a really wonderful place for us to have this event. And so without further ado, I want to move right into, again, a very brief, abbreviated history of the council. Now, our starting point really for thinking about the council is the Edict of Milan. Up until the Edict of Milan in the 4th century, Christianity, as the world knew it, really was not much of a unified religion, right? People didn't understand it to be unified, and it really never had been, at least not in the sense that we have come to think of it now. And one of the places that I really like to go to consider the sort of breadth and the complexity of Christian theological thinking in a pre-Nicene format is to look at the Acts of the Martyrs, which are read by many historians as a sort of ongoing debate about the nature of Jesus and about our relationship with him. And if you can, really the sort of implication of that being that many people in the first centuries of the church looked to the martyrs as exemplars of faith. And because they were exemplars of faith, they also for many represented true orthodoxy, right? So if their practice led them to make a sacrifice for the sake of the church, then they must have been on to something. And in that period, if you could get people to hear your theological point of view on the lips of a martyr, it might say something about your own orthodoxy. And so often you see in the early centuries of the church bishops quoting the martyrs to back up their theological arguments. And also, the martyrs sometimes used as sort of competition with the bishops. If you can get a martyr to agree with you, you might have something of an edge in the debate. So they were really seen as a source of theological authority. But of course, all of these contested ideas that we find in the words of the martyrs are happening on the margins of the Roman Empire. And theological disagreements among marginalized people are really probably not of much interest or concern for the imperial authorities at that time. But once the Edict of Milan is brought forth by Emperor Constantine, all of that really changes. Suddenly, the theological debates among Christian leaders may be seen as a threat to an empire that's pretty precarious. And the church may not be able to offer the sort of unified voice in prayer that an emperor would desire, or at least that seems to be how Constantine thought of it. And so what was at issue? At issue was this notion of the ousia. And I just a side note, as a scholar of practical theology who studies contemporary church and society, I never in a million years thought that I would use the word homoousios in a lecture. But here we are. It turns out that theology is important. And so the notion of the substance or the person of who Jesus is in relationship to God really explodes in the 4th century. And it's Origen who had suggested this word substance, that Jesus, the Son, is of the same substance as the Father, and that Jesus is eternally begotten. And it seems to be an important enough idea for the people of the church in those early centuries that they begin to contemplate what this could possibly mean for their contemplation of who God is, who Jesus is in tension with the biblical witness that we find about the God of Israel. So it's a tricky question, and it remains a tricky question for the church today. In fact, there is evidence that in Jewish circles, there was still quite a bit of openness to the possibility of being a Jesus follower into the fourth century. But adherence to the Trinitarian Christianity that emerges from the Council of Nicaea really disqualified one from being able to hold those two identities together. So you really see a sort of a more solidified break between Christianity and Judaism as a result of what happens at the council. And so, as we're thinking about the Council of Nicaea and the Nicene Creed, Trinitarian Christianity, we often think about those things as a symbol of unity. But I think it's important too to think about what kind of disunity might come about from developments like Nicaea. So, as fourth century Christians are trying to figure out how to grapple with this question, how to hold together Jesus' identity as God with the biblical witness of the God of Israel, there are some options for consideration that we find in the early church. There's the notion that Jesus was adopted as the son. Jesus, the Logos. Jesus was adopted through the Logos, which is this divine being. You hear that idea from Paul of Samosata. Dionysius of Alexandria emphasizes in his writing the distinctiveness of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And there are certainly merits to his argument, but of course, then there's also the risk of a tritheism. And then finally, we have the position that becomes most famous from Arius, although it's first articulated under Lucian of Antioch, that the Logos is subordinate to the Father. That the Logos is indeed a divine being, but that the Logos is created. And the attractiveness of this position, right? If we think about that tension with the God of Israel, the attractiveness here is that this protects the majesty of God. It protects the oneness of God in ways that don't complexify it. But challenges to the divine equality of Christ were really seen as problematic and in some cases heretical, and now, of course, solidly heretical in the church at that time. So there's a lot of theological debate happening in the lead up to Nicaea. You have many of the supporters of Arius being exiled from where they had once lived and worked in Egypt, and they're in exile in places like Asia Minor and Palestine. And Emperor Constantine really saw the disunity of the church that was playing out among the Egyptian bishops who opposed Arius as deeply problematic for the unity of the empire and for the church's support of his leadership. And so this all sort of erupts with a controversy in Nicomedia. Nicomedia had been the former territory of Licinius, a rival to Constantine, who he had recently defeated and killed. But Nicomedia happened to be Arius's place of exile. And so in order to sort of quell the division and the disruption, Constantine called an ecumenical council at Nicaea, which is in modern day, it's in Turkey, but in that kind of ambiguous region between Greece and Turkey in the year 325. And this is where I want to just take a minute to take note of the relationship between the church and politics. As many of you are probably aware, the story that I have just sort of told you about the lead up to Nicaea is much more complex than what I've been able to present in a short amount of time. That's in part because these debates went on for decades and centuries, really from the apostles all the way through Arius and beyond. But it's also really complex because of what's happening in the realm of the empire and of politics. I wanted to take a quick dip into church history in order for us to really see how intricately connected these developments in theology are with the political and military movements of the day. And today, there is quite a bit of division in our church and in our world. And many of the people in our pews, many of even the clergy would much rather leave politics aside, right? That politics is something to be avoided in our pulpits. And I think that certainly there is wisdom to treading carefully in political grounds and making sure that what we speak is gospel truth, right? And not coming from a place of political loyalty to one party or another. Um, but the battles of culture, unfortunately, are really intricately interwoven and interconnected with the way that theology has developed through the history of the church. And I see no better example of that than the Council of Nicaea itself. We see time and time again in church history an impulse to withdraw, to adopt a kind of sectarianism where the church seeks to live out an alternative existence, free from the divisive messaging of the political sphere. And there are times where that may make sense for us. But what do we do when political actors bring the very substance, literally, of our faith into the bright daylight of public discourse? There may be times when we don't have much choice but to engage this discourse. And it's always my hope that as we do so as citizens of the heavenly city, with some differentiation from the values or virtues that guide those who are seeking earthly power through political, military, or economic means. And I realize that that's a very Augustinian framework, so I'm skipping ahead a bit in history. But I actually think that in Augustine's work, he is responding to the fallout from Nicaea in developing his political framework in the city of God. That's a lecture for another day, but I do think the implications there are interesting and important. My point for now is that when we think of Nicaea as a space for discerning what Christian unity looks like, that is not a space that's free of politics. It's also not a space that's free of the work of the Holy Spirit. We should always keep this in mind as we are studying and engaging these doctrinal debates in our history, examining how history can show us that these debates, while they have metaphysical implications, do not remain purely in the realm of the metaphysical. And I think that that's important for our church in the moment that we find ourselves right now. And so that's let's move on to the events of the council itself. So the council is a space that was kind of rife with bishops. There were somewhere between 200 and 320 bishops. Eusebius says there were 350 bishops. The actual number there is lost to history. Emperor Constantine presided over the council, and witnesses from the time really saw this as representing the full diversity of the church. I think it's also helpful to note, and this is something that came up multiple times at the conference in Thessaloniki, that that while the bishops had arrived at a relative sense of safety in this moment, there is a lot of trauma in the room, right? Christians who had experienced persecution were now coming together. They were coming together with imperial authorities who at one time had persecuted them, coming together with Christians on the opposite side of an issue. So while we might want to think of this as a sort of a beautiful space of a kind of finally arriving at safety and unity, there also is some tension there. And that is going to continue to be a theme as we move forward in history. Only bishops had voice and vote at the council, but there were many others present, including Arius, who had been invited to defend his position. He was a presbyter at the time. And then, of course, most famously, Athanasius of Alexandria, who was a deacon at the time and would go on to champion the cause of Nicene Christianity throughout the church. And then the kind of basic outcomes from the council, we have, of course, the Nicene Creed that we continue to confess in churches around the world today. And then homoousios, that term, that what becomes the symbol of the Trinity, homoousios, this is credited to Constantine himself. Um, it becomes a space for the church's discourse around who God is. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that in the rest of the presentation. The Arian position is condemned, Arius and his supporters sent into exile. Um, there are also some kind of disciplinary matters to take care of along the way. You have the New Testament canon affirmed, a common date is established for Easter, Episcopal jurisdiction is established according to imperial administrative boundaries. While that may have been a sort of informal structure for the church up to that point, it became formalized at Nicaea. And then a sense of uniformity in rules for what the limits of episcopal authority were. And I want to take just a moment to talk about this notion of homoousios, of the creed itself, as providing for the church a shared vocabulary and grammar for our theological discourse. Often when we think about Nicaea, it's discussed as a sort of time of theological rigidity or doctrinal crystallization. And my understanding of the council and of how it has developed since that time is really that it's anything but, right? And you do have the condemnation of the Arian position, but really, as we will see, very little is settled by the Council of Nicaea. The council, along with the Christological and Trinitarian insights that have come about because of it, has been used throughout the history of the church at times as a kind of weapon against dissenting voices. But much of the dialogue among historians and theologians who are studying the Council of Nicaea is that the council itself and the creed, really what they provide are the sort of the terms of the debate. Really, Nicaea is about what are we talking about when we talk about God? I think that's a helpful tool for us as we think about Trinitarian theology through the ages. And of course, it's clear that very little was settled at Nicaea for once and for all. Constantine himself would quickly become uncomfortable with the fallout from Nicaea, maybe feel a little bit repentant about how Arius and his supporters were treated. More likely, he's just concerned about the ongoing disunity of the church because Arius continues to gain supporters even after the Orthodox position is established at Nicaea. Constantine's sons after him would take opposing positions, as would emperors Valentinian and Valens toward the end of the century. So we have emperors weighing in on whether they're following the Nicene formula or they're followers of Arius. And of course, this is going to get wrapped up in war. It's going to get wrapped up in political maneuvering throughout the empire. And this continues into the reign of Julian, also known as Julian the Apostate, who sought to restore pagan practices in the Roman Empire. And he very famously called Christians from both camps back from their exile. And many scholars believe that this was a move that was really meant to foment division within Christianity. But what history would show is that what the result of that was anything but. This was a time of tremendous growth for Christianity. At the beginning of the 4th century, about 1 in 20 residents within the Roman Empire would have considered themselves Christian, and it was 1 in 2 roughly by the end of the century. So Christianity really has taken over pretty solidly by this point. Julian's attempts were quite unsuccessful. And so that leads us finally to another important council, which is the First Council of Constantinople. And my Orthodox colleagues are very insistent when we talk. This was a really interesting, one of those really interesting ecumenical learnings for me at at the conference in Thessaloniki that many of uh, us in the West, when we talk about the creed, we refer to it as the Nicene Creed. But for my Orthodox colleagues, they were insistent that we call it the Nicene Constantinopolitan symbol. And for them, Nicaea is sort of meaningless without Constantinople, and there are some changes that are made to the creed. Um, there's no evidence that the Nicene Creed was considered to be a baptismal creed at the time of the First Council of Nicaea, but by the time of Constantinople, we have plenty of evidence that it is in fact being used as a sort of proclamation of faith, being used for the instruction of the baptized. And and also because Emperor Theodosius was so dedicated to not only allowing for the practice of Christianity, but mandating it as the official religion of the empire, this is also a time when we see growing restrictions on other religious practices, including outlawing conversion to Judaism and the closing of certain pagan temples. So that's just, I know that that's like a very high level overview of Nicaea. And if you are a history buff, my apologies. That's about all we have time for because I really want to get now to the legacy of the Council of Nicaea for us. Um, the Council of Nicaea is it really gives us some amazing treasures in the church. Of course, our contemplation about the mystery of the Trinity and all that that has meant for Christian theology, for Christian practice through the ages. And also this, for me, really what comes through most clearly is this, the complexity of being a united church. What does it mean to live in unity? I think Constantine maybe wanted something more along the lines of uniformity, but what history has done is showed us that unity is so much more complex than all agreeing all the time. So I'm gonna like spend the rest of the presentation kind of contemplating that for us. But of course, there's some baggage for us to consider. The notion of an imperial Christianity really emerges first at Nicaea and then really loudly and clearly at Constantinople. And moving forward from that, then the complex relationship between the church and the government, right? That's something that we continue to grapple with until today. And so the question that I ask us to consider as we move forward is how does the council equip us not to erase the diversity of the church, including cultural diversity, including theological diversity, not to erase that, not to strive for uniformity, but actually to engage diversity as we continue to move forward in our life together. So now I want to skip way ahead in history to 2018. So in 2018, the Synod of the Ecumenical Patriarchate of the Orthodox Church decided that it would recognize an independent Orthodox Church in Ukraine, granting it autocephaly, granting it its own primate. For context, the Orthodox churches are independent churches that are in communion with one another. The Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople is considered first among equals. And the current Ecumenical Patriarch, Bartholomew I, he carried through with that decision made by the Synod. And in 2019, the church in Ukraine was granted autocephaly. In response to that, the Russian Orthodox Church broke communion with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And this was all wrapped up in a lot of complexity, but the independence of the Ukrainian Church, which is the historic origin place for the Orthodox Church in Russia. This was seen as a threat to Russian identity. And it got really, the whole question got wrapped up in a kind of Christian nationalism that we see in Russia, we see in the United States, we see in all kinds of places. The US is not unique in grappling with this. Patriarch Bartholomew's reading of the situation seems to be that the Ukrainian people wanted ecclesiastical independence, just as they had achieved political independence from Russia. Requests for an independent church were coming from the Ukrainian parliament, and from the president and prime minister at that time. Vladimir Putin has named the church schism as one of the factors justifying the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And Patriarch Kirill of Moscow frames Constantinople's decision as a threat to Russian national identity. Some in the Russian Orthodox Church have compared Putin to Emperor Constantine. Both sides in this schism have characterized the other as the Antichrist. And now I want to move us across the world to Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church in Pittsburgh. When this schism happened, it created a conundrum for the people of Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church. And this story comes from a colleague, Radu Bordiano. Dr. Bordiano is on the faculty at Duquesne University and is also an assistant priest at the church. In a paper he gave, Bordiano described a conundrum facing his church. While national churches may make sense in certain parts of the world, Orthodox Christians living in diaspora often find that they worship with people from across the Orthodox world. So what is a Greek Orthodox Church in the United States to do with its Russian Orthodox congregants when the Patriarch of Moscow breaks communion with Constantinople? Are they be turned away at the sacrament? Holy Trinity decided that the answer to that question was no. But, notes Bordiano, that highlighted another tension in their church's Eucharistic practice, which had been up to that point to deny communion to Roman Catholics who worship with them. And that denial is on the basis of the historic schism between Rome and Constantinople. Now, Holy Trinity has a very particular and relational experience of the church's Catholicity, right? That is the international and culturally diverse nature of the people of God. Bordiano's work raises a question for us. If as a result, and here's the question, if as a result of this perspective on Catholicity, the local church reaches an understanding of unity that is different from that of the hierarchy of the church, what are the limits of its pastoral discretion? So far in Pittsburgh, those limits have not extended beyond the Russian Orthodox, who are faithful Christians worshiping there. So far the Roman Catholics aren't communing. But Bordiano's question really inspires us to think about what unity looks like. Communion really is a pretty high standard for unity when we think about all that is required there and all of the actors and peoples involved with that. And so for the rest of the presentation, I want to get us thinking about some other ways that we might consider approaching unity at a time when there is so much disunity in the world and in the church. And the first of these frameworks is a framework of dialogue. And I'm starting here because in many ways, dialogue is the easiest one to step into. And when I talk about dialogue, I'm talking about the very formal dialogue that happens at some of the highest levels of denominational Christianity, ecumenical dialogues of the variety that we may associate with a place like Geneva, Switzerland. And these dialogues have a lot to do with schism, but the schisms tend to be very old and sometimes indirect, right? Protestants who are out of communion with Orthodox churches are out of communion because Roman Catholics were first out of communion, right? So these dialogues are usually involving designated representatives of denominations or theological traditions, engaging in bilateral dialogue that's meant to move in the direction of healing from historic theological differences that have at times contributed to violence in the church and in the world. I'm thinking here of international Anglican and Roman Catholic dialogues, the Anglican Roman Catholic Commission for Unity and Mission, or the Lutheran Orthodox Joint Commission. These are high-level dialogues that may at times feel a bit abstract to people in the pews, but really have real-world consequences. And so I commend them for study, of course, for clergy, but also for formation in our churches. At our ecumenical conferences with ecclesiological investigations, we have found that the best way to worship together is with a service of the word, right? We can pray and sing together, we can read the Bible, we can preach the word, but we cannot commune. And it was really interesting that at a conference about the First Council of Nicaea, never once did we recite the Nicene Creed together. And that is, of course, because of the Filioque controversy. So, Lutheran Orthodox dialogues that have asked Lutheran denominations around the world to consider whether or not they will continue using the Filioque clause becomes consequential for these ecumenical relationships. Perhaps more immediately for the church's visible unity, in contrast to the world's violence, I'm thinking of a 2023 trip that the previous Archbishop of Canterbury made to South Sudan with Pope Francis and moderator Ian Greenshield of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland, calling for peace. While the visibility of bishops is not going to end strife and violence on its own, at the very least, it provides a counter witness to political forces that seek division within the church, seek to use division within the church as an argument to support their grab for power. So this pilgrimage was the brainchild of the churches of South Sudan, and these efforts are made possible because of the dialogues that bring people to the table together. They may never bring us into communion on this side of the eschaton, but there is this visible manifestation on what we do agree on as the people of God. So dialogues is the first framework for us to look at. The second one is collaboration. And collaboration, if dialogues are sort of a direct descendant of the 20th century ecumenical movement, collaboration is a sort of a different pathway, shall we say, to work across theological and denominational differences. In some parts of the church, especially in evangelical churches associated with the Lausanne Covenant, the ecumenical movement in its technical sense has become suspect because it is often understood in opposition to evangelizing mission. Many of those churches no longer participate in organizations like the World Council of Churches or the National Council of Churches, and this is certainly the case for many evangelicals in the United States. But that doesn't mean evangelicals have stopped cooperating with other churches and church bodies. A 2021 study in commemoration of the International Missionary Council, celebrating 100 years, surveys collaborations throughout North America and captures the astounding diversity of the small e ecumenism that is being practiced right now, many times at a very local and focused level. The volume argues that in many cases, the top-down approaches that are given to the top-down approaches of the previous century have given way to relational networks of churches and faith-based nonprofit organizations that embrace ecumenical unity, mutual partnership, cooperative projects, and decolonizing frontiers. That's not to say there aren't still top-down approaches that are very effective in ecumenical work, and I myself am a beneficiary of the full communion agreement between the Episcopal Church and the ELCA as an example. But what attention to collaboration points to is a sort of creative boundary crossing strategy that Christians are innovating in local contexts for the sake of God's mission. And these initiatives are often undertaken for the sake of the neighbor and the neighborhood. Racial reconciliation, justice for the poor, and care for the planet were often the shared concerns of the collaborative networks that were included in the study. So again, these collaborations are not a stand-in for communion, but that doesn't prevent them from being a witness to the peace and unity we strive for in the church as we seek to more fully embody the values of God's kingdom. I would be remiss if I didn't take just a moment to talk, to talk about synodality. Synodality, if you've been following the conversation, is all the rage in the Roman Catholic Church, and it has had ripple effects throughout the churches around the world. Um, the call of Pope Francis, this is really in many ways a mark of his tenure in the Holy See, was to become a more synodal church. And what does he mean by that? This has been seen by many as a way for the Roman Catholic Church to really live into the Vatican II ecclesiology of the Church as a people of God journeying together. Synodal processes are to be carried out at the diocesan level in order for all of God's people to be both seen and heard and to hear one another, right? To really engage in listening and speaking. Historically marginalized groups are to be especially lifted up in these processes, and attentiveness to the work of the Holy Spirit is strongly encouraged. The Synod on Synodality, which ran from 2021 to 2024, was designed as a space for the whole communion to discern together what it looks like to be a more synodal Roman Catholic Church. Now, the results of the synodality movement thus far are pretty mixed, right? It hasn't been like a home run for the Roman Catholic Church in any sense of that word. And perhaps most surprisingly, one of the most challenging issues especially at the Synod on Synodality, but also the synods happening at regional and diocesan levels, one of the most challenging issues has been the ordination of women to the diaconate. The Amazon Synod of 2019, for example, affirmed the ordination of married men to the priesthood in some instances, as well as a continuing study of the ordination of women deacons. Many conservative Catholics around the world saw this as evidence that the synodal process is just a backdoor for modern and progressive ideologies to make their way into the church. And so the results of some of these decisions and some of these commendations are still pending. And you'll see similar feedback from the synods that have happened in Germany and Australia. But I think it's important for us to pay attention to this conversation, which I believe is still in its infancy. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with synodality in the Roman Catholic Church with Pope Leo. Another really important outcome of the synodality conversation has been the ecumenical response. Other communions and federations of churches are asking themselves about how synodality is already functioning in the way that their polity is structured, or how synodality might help them to be a more holistic church. And I've read pieces from Orthodox and Reformed and Lutheran perspectives. Some are suggesting that a more synodal Anglican communion, so I do want to get a little bit of Anglican communion discussion here. A more synodal Anglican communion might address some of the sources of disunity facing Anglicans right now. What would it take for the Anglican communion to foster more listening to God's people, especially the laity, and to affirm the particularity of the diocesan church, such that the communion is expressed through the ways the various dioceses walk with one another? The synodal approach is often characterized as being deeply informed by post-colonial thinking. And so, although she's not necessarily using the language of synodality, I wonder how the synodality approach plays into Coquelin's description of Anglicanism as a polycentric and polyvocal communion. Could synodality, in a more sort of intentional way, help the communion to embrace that polycentric identity? And that leads me to my last framework for unity, which is that of mutuality. In a book that I highly recommend if you've not read it before, by Charlie Bell. Charlie Bell is a priest in the Church of England and a practical theologian. He suggests this mutuality as a way of approaching disunity in the church. As some of you know, many of you know that some of the traditional instruments of communion within Anglicanism are not as effective as many of us would hope for them to be. In his book, Bell suggests that mutuality could be a pathway forward. And in his work on unity, what he's really pointing to is, again, thinking of synodality. In a church that was once historically organized according to geography, when heated debates over the ordination of women and LGBTQ priests and bishops gives way to what he calls doctrinal denominationalism. It allows for Anglican churches to plant bishops on geographic territory that already has a bishop, and for priests to be under the authority of a bishop who is located elsewhere in geography. Bell calls for a more ecclesiologically considered approach to navigating disagreement that's rooted in a more metaphysical and sacramental understanding of Anglican Christian identity. If the koinonia or fellowship of the church is a gift received in baptism, then Anglican identity should be understood as a mutual sharing in that fellowship. Unity is, for Bell, the result of a Trinitarian overflow that we are to receive with gratitude, helping us to recognize that we sit shoulder to shoulder at the table with others with whom we may or may not disagree. So I know that was very, very quick, but hopefully gave you some food for thought. And so I just want to end by noting that if we consider the creed and the Trinitarian formula to be a doxological creed, right? Charlie Bell describes the three creeds, the Athanasian, Apostles, and Niceno-Constantinopolitan creeds, not as an outline of that which is required for salvation, but as a profession of the church's understanding of who God is. Many in the church will describe the Nicene Creed as doxology, as our praise, and as our shared language, our shared song for who God is. As a reminder, as I mentioned earlier, this helps us to set the boundaries for our discourse, but it also establishes a sense of a Trinity that is both unified and diverse in its being, in his being. Yeah. Love for the neighbor and respect for the diversity of God's people overflows and invites us to consider unity with all of the frameworks that become possible when we understand that our identity in Christ is a gift. And so I wanted to end just commending us to think about unity as something that's promised. It's promised to us in Christ. It's to be fulfilled in the eschaton. And yet God has given us this church so that we can figure out how to live into our unity now, sometimes in very small and humble ways, like the kind I've just mentioned, but always as witnesses and as a sign to God's kingdom. I'm happy to take questions with the time we have left.
Britta, thank you so much indeed. Whilst people are typing their questions into the Q&A box, and I will present them to you, I hope thematically, to give them time. I mean, one of the things that you brought out so well is that everything's paradox. It's paradox all the way down. It's contradictions all the way down, and depending upon how we feel about that is how comfortable we might feel with paradox. I wondered if you'd like to think about the contradictions that seem to be there between the creeds being used as a sort of an anti-heretical boundary marker. This is where you can go and no further, and how uncomfortable some people might feel with anything being determined as being heretical these days. Because after all, the word heresy comes from choice, and choice is a good thing. And the apparent contradictions that you pointed out, the Orthodox Church in Pennsylvania, where is Catholicity to be determined at the lowest possible level? I mean, is Catholicity something that is about subsidiarity? And how is something that is to be determined at the lowest possible level, can it possibly be understood as participating in the Catholic nature of the church? With all these competing goods, where do you think that the sweet spot is or could be?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I love that you use the word paradox. I'm not sure that I ever used it, but I am, after all, a Lutheran, and so it's the place that I live theologically. And so that may be why this makes so much sense to me.
Hmm.
Um, I, for me, if we think of the church as both gift, I used the framework of the church as a gift, but it is, I would say also invitation, right?
Hmm.
If we remember, I think part of the discomfort with uh, with using words like heresy uh, is attached to some of that imperial Christian baggage that I
Hmm.
mentioned, right? Um, but if we remember that the church is the church's destiny is the city of God, right? That it's a peaceable realm. Um, the heresy becomes less dangerous,
Hmm.
becomes less violent, right? And so we can begin to think of our creedal faith as an invitational faith. It's not that someone will be excluded even from community. They might be excluded from communion if they don't come to believe these things. And I've come a long way in my own practice of faith with this. I'm like a very kind of radically inclusive kind of Christian. But I also think that our sacraments mean something, that our faith has content, and that all are invited to contemplate that content. Um, and the invitation and the decision to say no to the invitation can be carried out in a peaceable way. So I hope
I
that
like that.
addresses the question.
No, I like faith having content. Very quickly, we had three people wanting to know what the name of Charlie Bell's book was.
It's called, I have it right here. I'll see if I can hold it up. Unity, Anglicanism's Impossible Dream, question mark. Great book of practical theology, where he really, and he's writing from the Church of England, right? So it's very
Mm.
focused on the polity of the Church of England, but it has really important implications for the rest of us.
My rule of thumb is any book with a question in its title, the answer is usually no. But that ties in really neatly with a question from Susan Lee, talking about how unity's always been elusive, valued, never really achieved. Do you think we should strive for unity today, or should we strive for faithfulness? And is unity and faithfulness opposed?
Hmm. No. I mean, I think they can come into they can come into tension. I think faithfulness will necessarily bring about unity. It may also bring about suffering, right? It may also bring about division. I think unity understood understood in some of the less again sort of perhaps a less overtly sacramental ways that I've described them. I think that those
Hmm.
are very achievable for the church, but of course as evidenced by some of the examples I shared, but of course there are new schisms happening in the church as well. So it's a movement, and it's not like we're on a progressive journey toward more and more unity all of the time. I think um, church history is complex and things come around again and again. But I do believe that the journey of faithfulness will bring us into a deeper sense of unity, if not necessarily new in numbers, right? We may not be united with more Christians, but I think we may be more deeply united with the people of God through time and place, more deeply united um, with the Trinity. Yeah.
So, I mean, it could be a virtuous spiral that unity leads to greater faithfulness, which leads to greater unity if we're good.
Indeed.
Yeah. Thank you, and thank you to Susan for the questions. If that don't seem to have any other questions from people, but as we're coming up to almost to the hour, could I just remind everybody, I'm Justin Anthony. I am responsible for continuing education here at the School of Theology. If anybody has any questions about continuing education, of which Lunch and Learn is part of, then please do address them to me. And to remind you all that our next Lunch and Learn and our last one for the academic year is on April the 7th, when Mark Ardrey Graves, who teaches church music here, will be talking to us about A Love Supreme, three American Psalms. I'll let you guess what one of them of those American Psalms might be. That's on April the 7th at the usual time. I want to thank Britta very much for the hard work that she put into this and for the kaleidoscopic vision that she gave from 300 to 2019 to last summer of the importance of how we understand ourselves in our standing with God and with one another through the creeds. Sidney Evans, who was Dean of Salisbury Cathedral in the late 1970s, said that he always liked singing the creed because somehow it meant he had to cross his fingers less often. So perhaps we ought to sing them rather than treat the creeds truly as a doxology. And I thank Britta very much for that. So I'll see you all again on the 7th of April. And thank you very much indeed, Britta.
Thank you
Thank you.
all for being here.